Jaya. Jai Radha Madhava Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavallabha Jaya Girivaradhari Jaya Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Janavallabha Jaya Girivaradhari Jaya Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Jaya Yashodanandana Jaya Braja Janaranjana Jaya Yashodanandana Jaya Braja Janaranjana Jaya Yamuna Tiravanamchari Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Kunja Bihari Yamuna Tiravanamchari Jaya Yamuna Tiravanamchari Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Yamuna Tiravanamchari Jaya Radha Madhava Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Nitai Gaura Haribo 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 Nitai Gaura Haribo Shri Radha Radhanath ki Shri Kiraj Govardhan Hari Ki, Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu Ki, Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki, Shri the Prabhupada Ki, Shri Shri Gaura Premanandi. So thank you all so much for joining this morning, and thank you for this honor of discussing today's verse. This chapter is from Canto 4, it's chapter 23, titled Maharaj Pritu's Going Home, and this is text 12. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Jananyadhiradhigatatmagatirnirihas Tat yaje chinadidang vayunena yenam Tavanna yoga gatibhiryatiraprammatto Yavad gadagrachakata surating nakuryat. So we can all repeat line after line. Jananyadhiradhigatatmagatirnirihas Tat yaje chinadidang vayunena yena Tavanna yoga gatibhiryatiraprammatto Yavad gadagrajagata surating nakuryat. Chinnanyadhiradhigatatmagatirnirihas Tat yaje chinadidang vayunena yena Tavanna yoga gatibhiryatiraprammatto Yavad gadagrajagata surating nakuryat. Chinnanyadhiradhigatatmagatirnirihas Tat yaje chinadidang vayunena yena Tavanna yoga gatibhiryatiraprammatto Yavad gadagrajagata surating nakuryat. Anyone wants to recite? Chinnanyadhiradhigatatmagatirnirihas Tat yaje chinadidang vayunena yena Tavanna yoga gatibhiryatiraprammatto Yavad gadagrajagata surating nakuryat. Okay, so we'll read word by word. Chinna, being separated. Anyadhi, all other concepts of life. The bodily concept of life. Adhigata, being firmly convinced. Atmagati, the ultimate goal of spiritual life. Niriyaha, desireless. Tat, that. Tatyaje, gave up. Achinnat, he had cut. Idam, this. Vayunena, with the knowledge. Yena, by which, Tavat, so long, Na, never, Yoga Gattibihi, the practice of the mystic yoga system. Yatihi, the practicer. Apramattaha, without illusion. Yavat, so long. Gadagraja, of Krishna. Katasu, words. Ratin, attraction. Na, never. Kuryat, do it. So now I'll read the translation. When he became completely free from the conception of bodily life, Maharaj Prithu realized Lord Krishna sitting in everyone's heart as the Paramatma. Being thus able to get all instructions from him, he gave up all other practices of yoga and jnana. He was not even interested in the perfection of the yoga and jnana systems, for he thoroughly realized that devotional service to Krishna is the ultimate goal of life, and that unless the yogis and jnanis become attracted to Krishna Katha, narrations about Krishna, their illusions concerning existence can never be dispelled. So you can all repeat after me. When he became completely free from the conception of bodily life, Maharaj Prithu realized Lord Krishna sitting in everyone's heart as the Paramatma. Being thus able to get all instructions from him, he gave up all other practices of yoga and jnana. He was not even interested in the perfection of the yoga and jnana systems, for he thoroughly realized that devotional service to Krishna is the ultimate goal of life, and that unless the yogis and jnanis become attracted to Krishna Katha, narrations about Krishna, their illusions concerning existence can never be dispelled. So this translation and purport is by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada ki. The purport says, as long as one is too much absorbed in the bodily conception of life, he becomes interested in many different processes of self-realization, such as the mystic yoga system or the system utilizing the speculative empiric methods. However, when one understands that the ultimate goal of life is to approach Krishna, he realizes Krishna within everyone's heart and therefore helps everyone who is interested in Krishna consciousness. Actually, the perfection of life depends on one's inclination to hear about Krishna. It is therefore mentioned in this verse, Yavad Gadagaja Katasu Ratingna Kuryat. Unless one becomes interested in Krishna, in his pastimes and activities, there is no question of liberation by means of yoga practice or speculative knowledge. Having attained to the stage of devotion, Maharaj Prithu became uninterested in the practices of jnana and yoga and abandoned them. This is the stage of pure devotional service as described by Rupa Goswami. Anyabilash darshunyam jnana karmadhyanavritam anukulyena krishnanu shilanam bhaktiruttama. Real jnana means understanding that the living entity is the eternal servant of the Lord. This knowledge is attained after many, many births, as confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 7, text 19. Bahunang janmanamante jnanavalmang prapadyate. In the Paramahansa stage of life, one fully realizes Krishna as everything. Vasudeva savangiti sa mahatma sudurlabha. When one understands fully that Krishna is everything and that Krishna consciousness is the highest perfection of life, he becomes a Paramahansa or Mahatma. Such a Mahatma, Paramahansa, is very rare to find. A Paramahansa or pure devotee is never attracted by Hatha Yoga or speculative knowledge. He is simply interested in the unalloyed devotional service of the Lord. Sometimes one who was formerly addicted to these processes tries to perform devotional service, and the jnana and yoga practices at the same time. But as soon as one comes to the unalloyed stage of devotion, he is able to give up other methods of self-realization. In other words, when one firmly realizes Krishna as the supreme goal, he is no longer attracted by mystic yoga practice or the speculative, empirical methods of knowledge. Om Jnanatmirandasya Jnanangana Shalakaya Chakshuranmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Katamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pacharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshadarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Vanshaka Patrabhyascha Kripa Sindhya Vacha Vaditanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. So this verse is coming within the section of Maharaj Prithu leaving his kingdom behind for a life of renunciation and self-realization. There are many paths in order to attain self-realization, but the difference between all these other paths on one hand and bhakti on the other hand is that bhakti requires that we give up all of our own personal desires. This is true self-realization. When we start off though on the path of bhakti, we must admit that we do have those desires still. It's not unexpected because we're coming from so many lifetimes of conditioning, and so to get rid of all of those desires at first is not so easy. It will be there. We'll find that even as we're practicing devotional service, we're still wanting things, trying to put ourselves, families, friends forward, always wanting to be right. That those tendencies are there. But the point is that with the practice of bhakti, we're supposed to become free of all of those tendencies. So the kind of practices that will purify us, it's not the way we would think. It's not like a system of some services are better or stronger in getting us to that point, or that if we do many services, we'll get there faster, or if we've been practicing bhakti for a long time, that it necessarily just happens, or maybe, after a certain point, initiation, for example, it doesn't work like that. Devotion doesn't develop like that either. So then we have to think, well, if there's a point we need to get at, purification of material desires, development of devotion, how do we get there? So His Grace Shri Prabhu, he always uses this analogy, that if you want to get somewhere, what's the first question that you have to ask? I would say the same thing. You have to ask where you are right now. You have to know where you are in order to actually get some directions to get you to where you need to be. So that's sort of, it requires a lot of introspection and effort on our parts to understand that. Particularly because where we're situated right now is within the false ego. That's the obstacle to us developing devotion. So we need to understand this point a little more so that we can make progress to where we want to be. And so we see from the third canto discussions between Devahuti Devi and Lord Kapila, when she asks him about the ultimate goal of life and how to achieve it, he doesn't start telling her about devotional service directly. He starts by explaining how we got here, basically where we are right now. And then he comes to the discussions of devotional service. So basically, he takes us as far back as creation. And that's how important it is for us to understand this false ego better. It's not as easy as saying, well, I could just do it for Krishna I can just say I'm doing it for Krishna, and then that changes it. Right? It doesn't work that way. The false ego is very powerful. Thinking like that means we don't actually understand it well enough. So, if we want to make that change in order to escape from it, essentially, to escape from this world, right, by understanding how we got into it, how we got here, that's Sankhya Yoga. That's the philosophy that Lord Kapila teaches Devahuti, bringing us to devotional service eventually. Of course, the problem is when people understand the world better through Sankhya Yoga and they don't come to devotional service, but that's another discussion. We want this understanding to eventually get us to our goal. So when Lord Kapila starts his discussions, it is, again, literally from the point of creation. And at the end of the previous annihilation, upon the Brahman substance, there's actually a potential for the material universe, because everything there is actually lying in an unmanifest state, but it is still there. The energy of it is still there. And this unmanifest state of energy is called the Pradhan. So now we understand why in some places in scripture it said that Krishna's material energy is eternal. So all Krishna's energies are eternal. It's just that with the material energy, it's sometimes manifest and sometimes unmanifest. That's the difference. So the manifestation is temporary, but the energy is eternal. Right? So it's a lot like in physics, where energy can't be created or destroyed, it's just transformed. And so the Vedanta Sutras explain it in the same way. So what's in this space, though, that's interesting, because that's what helps us understand where the false ego comes from. We would expect that the material elements, earth, water, fire, air, and ether, form this unmanifest pradhan, but that's not all that's there. And those are just 5 elements. There's 25 elements that make up the unmanifested material creation. So it's very logical to understand it, because these 5 elements, earth, water, fire, air, and ether, they have to be perceived in a certain way. Particularly earth, we're able to see it, we're able to smell it, we're able to taste it, we're able to, well, if it moves, we're able to hear it, as well as, one more. So it's perceptible in all these 5 ways, and then all the other elements in decreasing order are less perceptible. So therefore the subtle elements are sight, touch, smell, taste, and sound. This is another 5 elements. So now we have the 5 gross elements, their perceptible characteristics. And then what would be the obvious next set of elements? It's the organs that we perceive these elements with. We perceive it with our ears, eyes, nose, mouth, and so on. So that's 5. And then, if you want to achieve that sense object, if you want to be carried to it, if you want your senses to be carried towards them, then you need working senses. The hands, the legs, the genitals, evacuation, the way you process it, as well as taste. So that's another 5. And then you have the subtle senses within, which take that perception, right, of the 5 main senses, working, knowledge-acquiring senses, and turn it into meaning for who we are. And that's the mind, the intelligence, the false ego, and contaminated consciousness. So essentially, if we think about it, everything that this material creation is literally just made up of sense objects and their enjoyment. How amazing is that? That's all the creation amounts to. It seems very complex when it eventually takes shape. But all it is an opportunity for the living entities to experience sense objects. The purpose for which we came into this material world. It's pretty surprising, deceptively simple. And also, to those who are not on a spiritual path, a little bit confusing. What's so wrong with that? Well, none of these energies that we've just described actually belongs to us. None of it belongs to us. None of us can claim it, right, before it comes into existence, when it's here and the pradhan. So what happens in the material world when you take or use something that's not yours? It's simple. You get punished. It's called stealing. So that's the problem with us trying to enjoy this material world. We're trying to enjoy energies that are not ours. Simply put, they just don't belong to us. And the natural consequence of trying to enjoy something that does not belong to us is consequence that we understand as karma. So karma results from this whole process of trying to enjoy. So the living entities that are now lying in a dormant state within the form of Mahavishnu, they are carrying karma that needs to play out now in the setting of this pradhan. So in order for it to play out, right, it must be within a certain parameter. Right? Anything that acts is within a structure or a form. So what gives that structure and form to karma? It's the 25th element, time. Time allows karma to play out in a forward and backward direction, right? The past, present and future. And karma itself is within the three modes of nature that act within like a lateral time frame. So now we have the understanding of what this pradhan actually is. Time itself, though, is not exactly one of the material elements, but it's an impersonal representation of Krishna. So if someone wants to accept Krishna's control, that's very good, but even if someone doesn't want to accept him as a person, you're going to have to accept his control as time. Because time is the ultimate controller. It's the ultimate force, it's the ultimate destroyer. And when you submit to Krishna in this way, he's not so friendly. So we remember how Arjuna felt on the battlefield of Kurukshetra when he saw time in a personal form. Or not in a personal form, but in a form. He saw time as the universal form. And Arjuna was a real warrior now. He's not like, the big talkers that we used to, people who claim to knock down 10 guys in one blow, that kind of thing. We're not talking about that kind of warrior. Arjuna was used to very extraordinary scenes of terror, death, fear, destruction. So when he was scared, essentially, we can imagine how terrifying this form of time was. And then Krishna explained to him when he asked, "Who are you?" "I am time, Kalo Asmi. I am the great destroyer of all the worlds." So time only exists in this material creation. It's only needed for this material creation because the living entities have karma. In the spiritual world where there is no karma, there's no need for time. So Lord Kapila then explains that Shri Shri Radharanath ki, Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu ki, Shri Giraj Govardhan Hari ki, Shri Leela Prabhupada ki. So then Lord Kapila he explains that the Lord is pervading this whole creation that's about to come into being from the outside as time and from the inside as the Supersoul. So the Supersoul is also present and controlling the creation, and we will talk a bit later about the Supersoul in relation to Maharaj Prithu, a bit more about our discussion. So on top of that, this material energy is resting upon the Brahman, the effulgence of the Lord. But still there's more. There's yet another way that the Lord pervades the entire creation. So when this material energy, by the will of the Lord, is ready to be woken up, right, this pradhan, by the action of time, we say that it becomes manifest, it becomes visible. If you're observing it, it's now visible, but it's still not yet taking on the shapes and the forms that it will as we know it here. So in this visible but undifferentiated form, it's called Prakriti. So that's the relationship between Pradhan and Prakriti. And this Prakriti requires a consciousness, just as much as we require a consciousness in order to function. And that consciousness comes from the Supreme Lord again. Right? So another factor that is not intrinsic to this material nature is the Mahatattva. The Mahatattva is necessary for this Prakriti to come to life, we could say. So the Mahatattva is also an expansion of the Lord. Essentially an expansion that runs this creation according to the karma of the living entities. So now we have this Prakriti that's permeated by the Mahatattva, and the Lord Mahavishnu, he glances into this Prakriti, injects the living entities along with all their karmas. Time is there to set things in motion, and everything starts to now assemble from these elements, these 24 elements, into all the shapes and forms that will be needed for the living entities to play out their karma. So we could say this Mahatattva is like the super soul actually entering into this cosmic body along with the souls. The same way the super soul enters into a body with the soul when it leaves its old body. And this obviously helps us to address the point that atheistic philosophers make about this nature, this material nature, being able to function on its own without any life. All those ingredients were there. They were existing there. The same way we could have the ingredients for a body, the earth, water, fire, air, and ether, along with time, also existing. But it doesn't mean that we can suddenly animate a body and bring it to life. We can't expect that those elements will just suddenly mix themselves into existence. And that's why science has failed with this understanding so far. But from our observation that the soul is required to animate a body, to bring it to life, we can also understand how this great cosmic body is brought to life by the Supreme Lord and his energies. So that is the feature of the superconsciousness. So now it gets a little bit technical. This consciousness, this cosmic consciousness, when it is not yet in touch with the material nature, when it is situated, we could say it's a connection from the spiritual consciousness. So when it is in its pure state, Bhagavatam describes, Lord Kapila says, it's actually, it's in pure goodness. It's on the transcendental platform. And in that transcendental environment, the Lord manifests as Vasudeva. So Vasudeva exists in this pure state, and therefore this condition of the Mahatattva, this cosmic consciousness that's pure, completely pure, is called Vasudeva Sattva. Vasudeva Sattva. So the Srimad Bhagavatam, we're very fortunate, helps us to explain Vasudeva Sattva in terms of the personality of Godhead so we can understand him better. Unfortunately, the Vedanta Sutra, although explaining the same things, is misinterpreted by Mayavadis with the guidance of Shankaracharya to believe that Vasudeva Sattva is just a state of consciousness. But we know that the state of consciousness is coming from the person Vasudeva. And it's important that we understand how the person Vasudeva then gives rise to the person Pradyumna, who gives rise to, Sankarshan, who gives rise to the person Pradyumna, who gives rise to the person Aniruddha, because these divine personalities are then permeating all the aspects of this material creation. If we don't have the understanding that they are persons, we'll miss that this creation is coming from a person and is meant for the service of a person. This is very, very important. When we don't have that personal understanding, we think, or we're likely to just give in to the teachings of science and atheism that everything's just existing. It seems so, but we don't know that underlying it all are these divine personalities who enter into this creation to assist the Lord in maintaining it, the same way they're maintaining the creation in in the spiritual world. Right? We remember how Krishna expands into Balaram, he expands into this fourfold incarnation. They're present in Dwarka in their first manifestation, in the second manifestation in the Vaikuntha planets, and they're manifested here as well. And they're controlling all the elements to make sure that creation progresses. So it is Vasudeva specifically who is referenced in so many places in Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam as the cosmic consciousness, aware of everything and pervading everything. Right? One of the most famous is verse 1 of Srimad Bhagavatam. Starts off, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Janmadi Asya Yataha Yato Nyavad Itrata Sharteshva Bigyaha Swarat. Tene Brahmaradaya Adikave Muhyanti Yat Suryaha. Tejavari Mridam Yatabinimayo Yatratri Sargo Mrisha Dhamna Svena Sadani Rashtakvakam Satyam Param Dhimahi. O my Lord Sri Krishna, son of Vasudeva, right? We'll explain this a little further now. Son of Vasudeva, all-pervading personality. Right? Vasudeva was present everywhere. I offer my respectful obeisances unto you. I meditate upon Lord Sri Krishna because he is the absolute truth and the primeval cause of all causes. Vasudeva is coming into this creation to set it off. Sustenance, because maintenance is also left to him. Right? Maintenance is a function of the Supreme Lord. Brahma and Shiva, they can be empowered to perform secondary creation and destruction respectively, but maintenance exclusively is done by the Lord himself, by his powers. And destruction of the manifested universes. He is directly and indirectly conscious of all manifestations. We know how. And he is independent because there is no other cause beyond him. Right? There was nothing that started everything in the beginning. Everything was dormant. It was just the Lord himself. He first imparted knowledge to Brahma, he places others in illusion, and only because of him do the material universes temporarily manifested by the reactions of the modes of material nature, now we understand, temporary manifest but always existing, appear factual although they are unreal. I therefore meditate upon him, Lord Sri Krishna, who is eternally existent in the transcendental abode, which is forever free from the illusory representations of the material world. I meditate upon him, for he is the absolute truth. So this personality, Vasudeva, he is the aim of all the transcendentalists, right? Even Maharaj Prithu. All of these, Gyanis, Yogis, they all want to go beyond the modes of material nature to come to Vasudeva Sattva. Right? In Vasudeva Sattva, they find Vasudeva. They're able to see him. Unfortunately, if they're impersonalists, they think that they've seen themselves. Right? But for those who will be drawn to devotional service, they're so enamored by seeing this form that they want to know more about him, and then the Lord, understanding their desire, he actually connects them to devotional service. Or like with Maharaj Prithu, who was already established in devotional service, he can communicate with Vasudeva when he sees him in the heart. That's what is being described in this verse. So Vasudeva is perceptible by all of us actually. Right? When we're in the lower stages of understanding, he is the conscience. Sri Prabhupada explains how he's the conscience. And then if we become a little more advanced, we can actually feel him or understand him to be the intuition, that voice that guides us, right, when we need it. And when we become more advanced as we progress in devotional service, then the Dami Buddhi Yogam Tam, he gives us the instructions by which we come to him, right? The same way that Maharaj Prithu has been given instructions. So Vasudeva is always there. We always have the ability to connect with him. But the reason why we're saying Vasudeva in particular, Vasudeva, Sarvamiti Saha Mahatma Sudurlabhaha, is that persons who are trying to reach him through other processes, they're getting Vasudeva, the predominating deity of the heart, not exactly Krishna. Right? So again, that's a point I'll come to. We just have to state clearly that until the false ego has been eliminated by the spiritual practices of the jnani or the yogi, they're not actually going to be able to perceive him. This is very important. Right? We can already understand from creation that Vasudeva is beyond the false ego. It's not possible to attain him unless one has overcome it. And it's the same understanding that we should get. what's required of us in order to achieve pure devotional service and perception of the Lord. So now we can go to the point of what's the difference between these Gyanis and Yogis achieving Vasudeva and not Krishna. So Prabhupada actually explains the difference in the purport of Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 26, Text 21. And he writes, Vasudeva is Krishna alone. When Krishna or Vishnu is alone without the accompaniment of his internal energy, then he is called Vasudeva. When he is accompanied by his internal potency, he is called Dwarkadish. Right? So that's the understanding. So we'll take ourselves back to when Krishna is going with Akrura to Mathura. Krishna, we could call him Vrindavan Krishna, the original personality of Godhead, does not go with Akrura. He goes to the border of Vrindavan, and then Krishna, Vasudeva Krishna, leaves with Akrura. So, do we understand them to be different persons? So we've said before that if you could separate yourself into different persons, depending on the sides of your personality that you want to show, right, it's similar to this understanding. You're the same person, but you're not the same when you're at work, when you're teaching a class, when you're at home relaxing with your friends. You have a different side. And if someone had to meet you in different environments, they think you're a different person, right? Depending on how dramatic the change is. So if you could divide yourself into your work personality and send that to work for you, or your strict personality and send that to give the class, and your more chilled personality, it's sort of like Krishna when he's at home in Vrindavan, Vrindavan Krishna. When he goes, Vasudeva Krishna goes to administer Mathura and then Dwarka and so on, Dwarkadish. And when he's in the material world carrying out the work of creation, then he's Vishnu, the Vishnu forms. So Vasudeva Krishna, he appeared in Mathura in the prison house, Srila Rupa Goswami explains. In Vrindavan, Krishna had appeared in Vrindavan, where he always is, where he never leaves. And when Vasudeva brought Vasudeva Krishna to Vrindavan, then they merged, right, for that time that Krishna was having all his pastimes in Vrindavan. And then when Akrura came to fetch him, then Vasudeva left. He went with Akrura, and he can be without his internal potency, right, Sri Radha. Vrindavan Krishna is never without Srimati Radharani. And then he also can be present with them, like when he's married to Rukmini and Satyabhama and so on. So there's a difference between the person Vasudeva, the person Krishna, although they're the same person. Right? We can't experience the sweetness of the personality of Vrindavan Krishna through the regal, strict, we could say maybe, the reverential Vasudeva Krishna, right, the prince. We attain that sweetness of Vrindavan Krishna through his internal potency, right, who is, of course, also manifested as a process of bhakti. So those who practice bhakti, they get to experience Krishna. Krishna, the personality, original personality of Godhead, Vrindavan, in Vrindavan, and others like these Gyanis and Yogis who have overcome the false ego, who have made such significant progress, they get to perceive Vasudeva Krishna, and it's not a small feat, right, to be able to overcome the false ego. Therefore they are called Paramahamsas. They're called Mahatmas. Srila Prabhupada describes them. They're very advanced. So then we've discussed up to the point of the Mahatattva, where does the false ego come from? So this consciousness now, which is in a pure state, it's actually the state of not just Vasudeva, but it's the state of the living entities originally. And when they misuse the independence that comes with that consciousness, that's when the false ego comes about. So within pure consciousness is the potential for a contaminated consciousness of the false ego. So Srila Prabhupada explains, we can't argue about why the false ego arises from pure consciousness. Factually, there is always the chance that this will happen, and therefore we have to be very careful. So, simply put, we are in the marginal position, on the margin between the true ego and the false ego, the pure consciousness and the contaminated consciousness. And when we fall into it, because we are on that margin, then this material world comes about in order to play out the false ego. Otherwise, in the pure consciousness on the other side, in the spiritual realm, there isn't any there isn't any need or any existence of the false ego. So it's important for anyone, even if they ever get to the pure consciousness, to be careful, Prabhupada says. Right? It's like a razor's edge to make sure that we never fall into this false ego again. So the false ego comes out of this consciousness in order to put into motion everything in this material world, and it extends itself in three ways: goodness, passion, and ignorance. Right? So the false ego in toto is controlled by Lord Sankarshan, we said, comes from Lord Vasudeva. And then the false ego in goodness that gives rise to the mind is under the control of Lord Anirudh, and the false ego in passion, which gives rise to the intelligence and the senses. Right? The senses we describe, the working senses and the knowledge acquiring senses, those are all under the control of Lord Anirudh, Lord Pradyumna, along with the intelligence. Intelligence is actually a function of the false ego in the mode of passion. Passion is required to bring something into existence, and intelligence is as well. So in the beginning we have this full pure consciousness, and then as these other as these modes are developing, initially there's this flurry of passion because Brahma is then created and he starts performing the secondary creation, and then as the living entities start playing out their karmas, ignorance generally predominates, right? Because ignorance is responsible for everything else. The false ego in ignorance then gives rise to all the elements, to all the senses, the subtle elements, right? Touch, sound, taste, smell, and sight, and then the sense organs by which they're perceived. Now we can appreciate why any kind of sense gratification is completely in ignorance. It comes from ignorance. It's not possible for us to justify it or to for it to help us in any way. Anytime we're trying to enjoy, it's always going to lead to ignorance. Intelligence itself, by itself, situated in passion, is more on the side of assisting the senses towards ignorance. So therefore Krishna says that if we want to utilize everything in order to get out of this material world, we have to have deliberate spiritual intelligence. That is actually what helps us to get to Vasudeva Sattva. So now we understand why it's so difficult for us to overcome the false ego. It's much, much more than saying, I'm going to do something for Krishna and automatically it goes from material to spiritual. Right? It's just not that easy. You literally have to transform these elements that have come from the false ego, essentially. Right? You have to undo this process of creation. Right? So it's not so simple, and we shouldn't take it in that way. Right? Srila Prabhupada told his disciples that you're just not afraid enough of Maya. Right? That's the problem. We're not actually realizing that even when sometimes when we say it's for Krishna, probably mostly when we say it's for Krishna, we're very much in the false ego. So what do we do about it? Right? We have to get to Anya Vilashita Sunyam. We have to be free of any kinds of desires for ourselves. Right? All this false ego longings. So Lord Kapila says then, right, one can get liberation from the false ego, liberation into Vasudeva Sattva, by seriously discharging devotional service unto me, and thereby hearing for a long time about me. Right? That's the secret, hearing. By thus executing one's prescribed duties, there will be no reaction, and one will be freed from the contamination of matter, from the contamination of this false ego and all its products. So this is what Maharaj Prithu did. Right? He had heard from Sanat Kumar, other great personalities, and Srila Prabhupada is advising that if the yogis and the jnanis want to get out of their material desires that are keeping them from discovering Vasudeva, then they should also hear. He says that they should hear. Essentially, serious, focused hearing is a meditation. It's a meditation. And if you're truly meditating on it, not just kind of doing time or thinking about how to challenge the speaker or falling asleep, anything in between those, it's not going to help you to achieve Vasudeva. Hearing is a meditation. It must be contemplated. It must be realized into one's life, and it must be translated into action. This is how the process of hearing becomes devotional service that will transform one. And it must be done every day, even a few times a day if possible, because you can only wear down the false ego with persistent action. Right? The same way water is very weak compared to a rock, but it can wear down the rock if it's dripping every time, all the time, constantly. Right? Even water is capable to wear down a rock. So this is how you can chip away at something as strongly rooted in your existence as the false ego. And therefore, Shunvatan Swahakataha Krishnaha Punya Shravana Kirtanaha Vidyantahasto Hi Abhadrani Vidunoti Suhrit Satam. So much instruction in the Bhagavatam about true hearing. What is the consequence, or what results from hearing? Then Lord Kapila says, this devotional service has to be performed strongly, he's using the word strongly more than once, in perfect knowledge, right, which you get from hearing, of course, right, and realizing it through meditation, and with transcendental vision. One must be strongly renounced and must engage in austerity and perform mystic yoga in order to be firmly fixed in self-absorption, or what we know now as self-realization. It doesn't mean that we must be more absorbed in ourselves. That's exactly the opposite. Self-realization. So obviously, Lord Kapila is guiding his mother about the devotional practices for realization in that time, right? The same way with Maharaj Prithu, it was meditation. But in another sense, we can understand that the process for self-realization in this age is also a meditation, the chanting of the holy names. Because it is just like the hearing process, it has to be done with focus, with complete focus. When we're chanting, looking around, thinking about other things, very, very inattentive, it's not meditation. And I've heard, Krishna forgive me, but I've heard devotees chanting like Hak Shnak Shnak Hak Shnak Shnak. That's not the holy names. I've heard devotees whistling when they chant. You can't actually whistle and pronounce a name at the same time. Right? So we're not actually aware of ourselves and how we're not practicing chanting as a meditation, and that's why we're not getting the results. We're not strongly practicing it. Strongly practicing it means the same kind of focus that a meditator would do. Right? The same way that Maharaj Prithu did, even up to the posture if we can do it. Right? His Holiness Ram Govinda Swami Maharaj was explaining that it actually helps us in our focus if we sit up in that lotus position with our back straight, nose in a straight line, and so on, eyes half closed. The chanting performed like that, for this straight period, is actually settling us into pranayama, the breathing. All of that is helping the mind to focus upon the chanting. So there's things we can do in order to help us to practice better. And we'll find then that we will definitely get what he describes here. Transcendental vision will become properly renounced. We'll be able to undergo whatever austerity is required of us. So it's all possible. It's very possible if we make adjustments to these, the ways that we practice hearing and chanting. So another thing that we can do, which is very important, is that we can pray to the Lord. So it goes without saying that in the previous ages, people who wanted to make progress in their devotional service, in their prasidia, the Yuga Dharma, they actually prayed then to this fourfold form. They prayed to Vasudeva, Sankarshan, Pradyumna and Aniruddha. Namaste Vasudevaya, Namaha Sankarshanaya, Sankarshanaya, Pradyumnaya, Niruddhaya, Tubhyam Bhagavate Namaha. This is from the 11th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, where it is a description of how personalities in the previous ages, particularly the Dwapara Yuga, they prayed, let me offer my respectful obeisances to the Supreme Personality of Godhead in the forms of Vasudeva, Sankarshan, Pradyumna and Aniruddha. And in that way they were getting control over their consciousness. To have clear consciousness, one has to worship Vasudeva, Prabhupada says. In order to get released from the false ego, one has to worship Sankarshan. Right? Associated with Sankarshan is Lord Shiva, who comes from Sankarshan, but this is actually Sadashiva. This is the transcendental Shiva, who is actually in the category of Vishnu Tattva. His incarnation in the material energy is the Devata Shiva. And it is said that that Sankarshan is worshipped through Sadashiva, Vishnu, and the snakes which actually cover him are representations of Sankarshan. We see the correlation. Sankarshan is also Anantashesh. And if we want to get free from mental disturbances, because we learned that Aniruddha controls the mind, then we worship Aniruddha. And then for that purpose, people also worship the moon planet. And if we want to be fixed in our intelligence, then we worship Pradyumna, right? And his worship is reached to Brahma. And Prabhupada says these matters are explained in the Vedic literature. So all of a sudden, it's very complicated. Or is it? In this Kali Yuga, we don't actually have to worship all these incarnations of the Lord. Right? We just have to worship one personality. Krishna Varnam Trisha Krishnam Sangopangashra Parshadam Yagyai Sankirtanai Prayer Yajantihi Sumeda Saha. Because Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is Sri Krishna Chaitanya. What does his name mean? Chaitanya means consciousness. That's the secret. He's here to awaken our consciousness, our Krishna consciousness, which is beyond, we've now understood, Vasudev Sattva. So, by worshipping the fourfold incarnation, we can get to Vasudev Sattva. But what if we want to go beyond that? If we want to understand Vrindavan Krishna and the sweetness of his pastimes and his original personality, we worship Sri Krishna Chaitanya, who awakens our consciousness to Krishna. So, more than just that we have to worship one person, this personality is so extraordinarily merciful to us that Srila Prabhupada says you just have to worship him by chanting. We do these worship procedures because it's important that we get into regulation, understanding God as the Supreme, coming in his time to worship him as he wants to in the temple as the king. It attacks the false ego, and that way it keeps us clean, right? You have to be clean to come to the temple. But the worship of Lord Chaitanya actually doesn't require any of that. It is simply Harinam Sankirtan, which anyone and everyone can do. So everyone, therefore, has the ability in this age to awaken pure consciousness through chanting and hearing as Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu gives us, by worshipping him through these processes and pleading with him for his mercy in order to achieve that. So thank you all so much for your kind attention. Grantaraj Bhagavatam ki, Srila Prabhupada ki. Are there any questions or comments or corrections?
Hare Krishna. So thank you for your wonderful class. I was listening to Bhakti Chaitanya Swami the other day, and he was saying that we shouldn't be so caught up with rules and regulations and, pranayam and all of those things, because then we'll be caught up with that and we will forget about Bhakti Yoga. So we should just concentrate on Bhakti Yoga, chanting Hare Krishna, and with attention, but not so rigidly, like sitting in a lotus position with your neck erect. Although that helps, but also Maharaj was saying that that's not so important.
No, I agree that in that like yogic understanding, where people may get misled that that's more important than the actual chanting, that's definitely a problem. But as devotees, we're always looking for ways on how to improve our chanting, how to make it better. So one of the ways that really helps is posture, because originally posture and breathing were meant to steady the mind. So I'm always hearing devotees when they're chanting, my mind is going everywhere. I'm not just hearing, I'm just having problems with it myself. And particularly the lotus position is almost impossible for me these days. But if someone can do it, like when I've seen devotees actually, they're so, they're able to attain a focus that's quite impressive. Yeah. So
thank you.
Thanks, Matri. Thanks so much. Any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you all so much. Hare Krishna.